Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ethical Consumer Podcast. I'm your host, Julia, and today I am here with Blake Rupe of University of Iowa. She is a sustainability researcher and the program manager for sustainability at U of I. Welcome, Blake.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. I am so excited because this episode, it's not really a follow-up to previous episodes that we've had, but you were actually the one that pointed me in the direction of Olivia Angus for Olivia for the Ocean, which was awesome. And she's great.
Yes, she's wonderful.
So that was super fun. And then one of the first few episodes that we did was with the sustainability manager for Single Speed Brewing here in Cedar Falls and Waterloo, Iowa, Rachel Beck. So this is kind of our second or third talk on sustainability that doesn't necessarily deal with just food and beverage. So we're getting to the nitty gritty, which I enjoy.
Wonderful. Let's get started.
Yes, I love it. So first of all, what is your favorite food, since we are technically a food and beverage podcast?
That is a lovely question. I would say probably anything that involves eggs, because those are essentially, they're not relegated to breakfast, but they're very much an essential part of breakfast, and breakfast is my favorite food category by far. So I would say pretty much anything with eggs. Although if I had to pick my favorite, if I were out at a restaurant, I would probably say eggs Benedict, because I can't make that myself. So it's definitely my go-to order at a restaurant.
I didn't intend to plug this, but since you've said it, we will actually be hosting a giveaway with some of our previous guests on the podcast. One of which is Frontier Co-op, not that far from where you are. Lovely. And one of the seasoning and sauce packets that they sent is actually for eggs Benedict sauce.
Perfect. So I'm gonna knock on wood.
It's like three. I can see it. I see the yellow of the package like 2 feet to my left. So
awesome. And we love Frontier Co-op. We love them a lot.
We do. Oh, they're so wonderful. Yes,
they really are.
Yes, Alicia came on, their sustainability coordinator. So we've had some. But as a researcher, you have a very unique perspective in the sense that you're working with the University of Iowa, and are you working not only with their campus and the operations on campus, but also researching different elements of sustainability in general? How does that look?
Yeah, so I think the umbrella of my office is I work at the University of Iowa. I'm in the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. And I think the umbrella of our office is we have a campus-wide reach. So we deal with work in athletics, in the hospital, on campus, in housing, in our dining operations, our facilities side with the pesticides and things we apply to campus, as well as just the management plan for our green spaces and our non-green spaces alike. Pretty much anything across the spectrum of campus that has to deal with not just the physical aspect of campus, but also our water, as well as the research and things that are happening and the classes that students take on campus as well. In the academic side, that entire umbrella really is what our office works.
So all of the things.
Yeah.
It's pretty incredible. Now, you have made your way up into kind of a higher position at the university, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what were your foundations? Where did you grow up? How did you end up where you are right now?
Oh, wow. That's a good question.
I don't need to hear about like your 2-year-old dance recital, but like
definitely didn't do dance. Should have. Might be a little bit more coordinated today if I had. I grew up in Southeast Iowa. I'm from a town called Ottumwa, which is it's a lovely town that is pretty much the hub of meatpacking in the region. They have a meatpacking plant that's owned by JBS currently. When I was a kid, it was XL. I don't know who owned it. In any case, the whole point is, so I grew up on a farm right outside of Ottumwa, just south of it. And I grew up, my entire childhood is it's the idyllic quintessential farm life upbringing. We bottle fed calves. We did a lot of cow herding with my family. Growing up, we had Angus cows that grew up on our property. And it was more of just from the aspect of my parents just liked to hobby farm. So they both had jobs just in Ottumwa doing other things, but they had this property, and they, whenever something interested them, they took it on themselves to bring it to the farm. So we went from having pigs to having peacocks to llamas for a while.
Oh my goodness.
And then they settled on Angus beef because they could, we could slaughter one a year and have it as something that we ate as a family for the whole year, and then sell the other ones that we raised, because Angus beef is really, really prized. So yeah, I grew up just out and about on our farm. There's a lot of wooded areas, so we were just in creeks and playing around in the woods and stuff. And so I just got this deep appreciation for just being outdoors and all of that from growing up and being outside literally my entire childhood. I don't have a whole lot of memories from being indoors, let's just say that. So yeah, so then when I decided to go to college, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. So I did this, I was sort of on this pre-law track. And then instead of spending 6 figures on a law degree immediately, I decided to work as a paralegal for a while just to see if I liked the real life of being in a law firm or different kinds of law practices. And thank God I did that, because that was not my calling. Not in a bad way, just in a very educated way. I just learned that I really wanted to do something that had to do with outside, outdoors, and just go back to my roots of where I feel comfortable, which is just being outside in nature. So yeah, I went back to school, got my master's in conservation policy at the University of Iowa. And so yeah, from there, I've settled into my lovely career at the university in the Office of Sustainability, helping researchers, faculty members, and students, and mostly students, conduct research and build their own portfolios for their own careers once they sadly leave our campus and go on to bigger and better things.
So you were kind of mother henning pardon.
Yes, it's a little bit more. I'm a little bit more in that sad mindset now, because it just ended, the semester just ended. So we have a little cohort of our interns who are now leaving us as of last week, and this week they're sort of tiptoeing out the door, and it's sad to see them go. So, but it's great. They've done a lot of really great work over the past couple of years.
Good. So do you get to work with them for all 4 years on campus? I know my fiance is a percussion professor at University of Northern Iowa, and some of them he works with for a couple years. Some of them he works with for the whole year. He does some, what do I want to call it? Gen ed classes. So in that case, they only get them for a semester, really, but you really build a relationship with the students over those 4 years, I assume.
Yes. And I would say a lot of the students that we've had that are leaving now, we've had them in our office for probably 1 or 2 years, 2 years probably max, because our office is fairly new. Like the university's had an Office of Sustainability, but it was housed in a different department, a different unit, and had a much different mission as an office, until I think it was just about 3 years ago, they hired my current boss, who is the director of our office. And then once he was hired, they sort of changed the mission of the office and turned it a lot more student focused and student centric. So then I was hired about a year after him into this role, as well as my colleague. We're a pretty small office. It's just the 3 staff members, the 3 of us. And so once the 3 of us were all hired and we started getting things up and running with the programs that we wanted to work on, then we started bringing students on. So hopefully now going forward, we're doing interviews and hiring new interns, and we're hiring a much younger crowd than the ones we hired previously, who are now leaving us. Because now we'll, as you mentioned, we'll be able to have them for a much longer time working with our office and helping us expand a lot of the mission that we do.
Cool. So does each semester, does a student take on a project?
It really is up to the student. We have, our office has a strategic plan that we hope to follow, just big picture, year to year. These are some things we want to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And then we try and find students who have an interest and a history and a background or a vision for their future that they could find a project that would fit in with what they want to do. So we know some of the things that are happening on campus, obviously not all of the things, which is why we have students, because they are much more knowledgeable about the ins and outs and inner workings of things that are happening on campus. But we kind of know some of the bigger buckets of things that we want to try and achieve. One of those being, like, an example being, we would like to be more sustainable in some of our housing practices, both on campus and off campus. And so we just hired an intern to help us work with our entire housing conglomerate on campus, because they have a huge energy footprint and consumption footprint on campus. And they just have, they have such a high turnaround of people who, live in on-campus housing, and it's so quick. So we would like to have the attention of those students who are in those housing units while we have them there. Mm-hmm. And then once they get turned loose into the greater Iowa City or corridor area to go find other housing and take other classes on campus and do that sort of stuff, we hope we can put a little bug in their ear while they're in our housing units, so that we can maybe talk to them later on when they do have more of a stronger foothold and idea of what they want to do when they, graduate. So that's just one example. We have a student who's going to be working on some housing projects, and she's trying to figure out if she wants to do on campus versus off campus, because we have a pretty good mix of both. I mean, honestly, if she took on either one of those, she would have a big impact, because there's just a great population of both of those kinds of students. So
definitely
a very long-winded answer to your question.
I love it.
Yeah,
no, and it's one of those things that, I would suppose, though it's not a thesis, or perhaps some of them eventually turn it into a thesis type situation. But when you're working on something over a long period of time, I mean, it's so great that each of them would probably have their own experiences, like you said, the things that they're interested in, and then being able to see a problem, hopefully find a solution, and get to continue. I mean, the information, really, like you said, especially for that specific project, helping students who are perhaps living on campus or off campus with their sustainability habits. I lived in the dorms for 1 year when I went to UNI, and we had a recycling room, mm-hmm. and we had a trash room. And I don't remember it being I'm digging a little bit. I'm not that old. I'm 32, but I'm still digging to remember what was the recycling and garbage situation on campus. And I don't know if there was a good recycling situation. Now, when I go up on campus, since Matt teaches up there are recycling bins across campus, just out next to the garbage cans. But I don't know if we had anything very good in the dorms.
Exactly. And we're starting to see, we have students that just come into, and this is shifting even more and more to a large population, but we have students who are coming in as 18-year-old freshmen, as just incredibly passionate eco warriors who want to make a huge difference, where it was usually they would come into campus, they would get involved in sort of a sustainability, like maybe adjacent student group or student org or something, and then they would, by their third and a half year on campus, they would then become eco warriors. But we're starting to see them come in as eco warriors to begin with, which is fantastic. That makes sometimes it makes our job a lot easier, because we don't have a whole lot of educating to do. We're being educated more and more by our younger students. This is absolutely fantastic. But we're starting to see, the talk now is recycling is everywhere, but it's not a perfect solution, and sometimes it's not even a good solution to the consumption problem or the waste problem. So we're starting to have students ask for more composting, because that can have a much bigger impact on the actual our actual energy consumption and carbon emissions and all of that. We can make a much bigger impact if we were to divert so much of our food waste and stuff. So so now students come in and they're not so much asking, where can I get my blue bin? But they're asking more where can I compost? Where can I take this sort of stuff? So we're starting to see it evolve more, and some of the rings of sustainability are getting a lot bigger around a lot of our student groups, which is it's fantastic to watch.
I will say one thing for Gen Z. They might be trying to steal our skinny jeans and our side parts. They're trying to nix the skinnies and the side parts, and I'm so not okay with that. But the eco warrior business, they are on it with their hydro flasks. And
they sure are. And their national park stickers on their hydro flask. Look, I'm all for it. You go for it. You tell me all those parks you've been to. Support our public land. I'm all for it.
I love it. Love it, love it. Now, something that you had mentioned previously when we talked before that you are very passionate about is marine conservation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is intriguing to me because you grew up in the Midwest on a farm. I mean, like, what is Ottumwa away from Cedar Falls? Like an hour and a half, hour 45?
Yeah, it might be closer to 2 because it's pretty closer. It's a lot closer to Missouri than you would think.
It is indeed. There's a train station in Ottumwa, isn't there?
There is. Yes, there is.
I love Amtrak. Amtrak makes me happy.
I've still never been on one. It's been something I've wanted to do forever, and it seems to get less and less accessible. More expensive for some reason. I don't get it.
That could be a future episode, the public transportation thing. I mean, that is a big part of sustainability as well, but the difficult part is when it becomes inaccessible. But it's because so many people have cars.
Yeah, I mean, and I look, I could have an entire podcast on my feelings about planes and the prices of plane tickets. Like, they're not based on anything but wishes and dreams. It drives me crazy, and there's no reason why. I've flown from Cedar Rapids, Iowa to Cairo, Egypt via Rome, Italy, and it cost less than a month of my rent at the time, which was not very much. It was, first of all, that's not based on actual facts and figures. That's not based on inputs. There's no inputs that are calculated to make that number make sense to me. So anyway, I could go on and on about it.
I feel a future episode coming on public transportation.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. That is though, like, you get to see the numbers with things because we're left wondering, well, is it because of gas or oil? And we're not going to talk about gas or oil today, but not politically speaking, but what makes it cost effective or not cost effective?
Exactly.
We don't always get to see that. You actually get to see numbers depending on what your students or you have studied in the past based on, how many, well, I don't know. You tell me. Has some of your personal research been on the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of our recycling system? Do you have numbers for like how much plastic actually gets recycled, or white plastic versus black plastic, which I didn't realize black plastic can't be recycled into anything but black plastic. That was mind blowing. Our last episode, actually, which will be as we're recording this, releasing tomorrow. But wonderful. When this comes out a week ago with Simply Good Jars, they have black lids on their jars and they're switching to white because black's not recyclable.
That is fascinating. There are so many of those. And I think that's one thing we find so interesting with students that come into the university is we don't have a student group we don't have a cohort of students that come in with the same exact knowledge and information about anything, let alone how to recycle, what to throw away, what you can and cannot recycle, whether you can compost a banana peel versus not, like that sort of information, because we have students coming to our campus from everywhere, including international students, but also rural Iowa students who, maybe like myself, I've done a lot of thinking and asking myself, like, why am I so interested in garbage and trash? Because it's not something that most people are passionate about, but I find myself obsessed with it because, like, growing up on the farm in the middle of nowhere, like, we didn't have garbage pickup. That wasn't a thing that happened. We didn't have there was a recycling day, which was like once or twice a year. We would throw all of our recyclables into the truck and take it to the recycling center, which was, like 25 miles away. So we had to do like physical hauling of our recycling, and then our garbage we just like burned. My parents to this day still burn their garbage, which is something that in rural Iowa most people actually do. Like, everybody has a burning barrel, so we call it. And I asked my dad the other day, like, how did you source burning barrels? Like, where did you find these barrels that became our burning barrels? Like, as an adult looking back, I'm like, did you go down like, there's no Craigslist back then. Like, how did you get a burning barrel? Yeah. So I think that's where my passion for garbage and stuff comes from, is because, yeah, it was a physical problem we had growing up, where that we had to like actually physically take care of our own garbage, which just made it a much more like omnipresent issue in our life, because yeah, everything we had to physically haul everything. So yeah, I mean, that is to say that's one rural story of rural Iowa, but we still have students coming in that have that exact same experience, where they're not aware that certain things are recyclable because it's not a process they grew up learning about when they were, in their own homes and stuff. So we have this wide spectrum of knowledge, all the way to, like eco warriors who usually come from a more urban background or suburban, where, they do have like intense and amazing like education programs from a young age for all of these different topics. So yeah, that's it's been very interesting having to process all of those kinds of students and get everybody sort of up to the same like level of knowledge about, at least not, it's not our job as an office to tell students that type 3 and type 4 recycle or plastics are always recyclable. Aluminum's better than everything else. Always use glass. Like, we're not trying to put those little things in people's ears, because as we've learned with our relationship with plastic as a generation, and as multiple generations have learned, is like, it's not the solution we thought it was, and our understanding of its problems have evolved since it was first developed. And I think what we want students to learn is not a fact that could be wrong in 5 years. We don't want them to memorize something that could be out of practice in the next 5 or 10 years, but rather how they can learn and understand the process of like, plastics itself could be a problem. Here's how to research when you go into the future and you go into your real life and you go into the world. Here's how to research and find answers to these problems and these issues, so that they can just become knowledgeable in how to find answers going forward. So they don't just have things that they've memorized that may be wrong in a couple of years, but they know how to find right answers as they evolve.
That is
that answers your question. But.
Oh, I love it. It does. Well, and that is just an amazing thing that you just said too, is it's not just about memorizing facts about how to dispose of the things that we are using. It's more so changing the way we use the things and the things
exactly
we use.
And like a great example of that is, it didn't occur to me until probably 3 or 4 years ago, but like, I remember a plastic water bottle when I was in middle school, let's say. That plastic water bottle felt different when you held it, because it was made out of like 90% more plastic and a different kind of plastic. But they've evolved plastic so much that the plastic involved in a water bottle is so thin and so different chemically, like sort of different chemically than the plastic of 20 years ago, just because they've gotten better at manufacturing plastic. So what was back in 2002, a product that was probably pretty easy to recycle and turn into something else, no longer is, even though it's the exact same thing, right? And so we want students to know that, today you may be drinking out of an aluminum can, but let's learn the process of aluminum and the science of aluminum, so that you understand why that's actually a really great product versus, water bottles of today versus yesterday. So yeah, just more elaborates that point of, learning about those processes.
That's it. The rules aren't going to change if you understand the composition of something per se. I mean, like you said, with plastic has obviously changed a lot. I'm remembering that we used to reuse single-use plastic water bottles for like months. Like you'd get something from a sporting event and we would just keep using them as kids. And my mom would buy the sport tops to go on the water bottles. I just feel like that's what people did. Like the metal water bottles weren't as much of a thing back then. And we could do that. But now I'm thinking of like the feeling, like if someone leaves a plastic water bottle at the studio or something like that, I'll pick it up and it crumples. Like there's not even, it's like, okay, it's made of 90% less plastic or a different type of plastic, but you also have less of a chance to reuse it too, which is like,
Mhm.
well, okay, if we could all just get metal ones, that'd be like the best option. But like,
Yeah. Yeah,
you can't
exactly.
win.
Exactly.
Sometimes you just can't win. Oh,
Mm-mm.
I love that
Definitely
your
not with
awareness came
plastic.
from. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, as I say, definitely, there's definitely no winning when it comes to plastic.
No, no, which is very difficult. Your awareness came so much from just looking, having to look and deal with your own trash, which is what Olivia had said as well when she started collecting her garbage and seeing, look how much trash I have. And then comparing it to the following year, look how much trash I hopefully have. That's less than last year's February, last year's March, what have you. I never thought about the fact that there would not be garbage pickup in rural areas. But I suppose depending on the size of your lot, yeah, a garbage man is not going to make like a 50-mile square to cover every avenue X, Y, and Z, literally, usually like 400 numbers in the street name or letter numbers. Letter numbers? Oh man, I wish this was coffee. It's tea. I think I need more coffee. Letters, letter combinations and the street names. Yeah, that would not work.
No, and I mean those routes. I mean they have it down to a science in urban areas, right? But those routes in rural areas, unless you get all of your neighbors on board, like you as a person, as a homeowner, if my parents, for example, if my parents wanted to have like a garbage company come and pick up once a week or once a month, they would have to try and get their neighbors to join in on that route as well. Or
Mhm.
else my parents would, the price of that pickup would be astronomical compared to,
Sure.
you know, what my bill here is in Iowa City for them to come and take recycling, trash, and compost from my bin every Wednesday. It's
Mhm.
it's almost nothing compared to what my parents would have to pay because they would be the only person that truck would have to come and service, and it would just it's logistically it would be a nightmare.
Right. Oh, most definitely. Did you just say you get your compost picked up curbside?
Yeah, Iowa City is wonderful. We have our recycling, garbage, and compost bins are all the same size. They just have a different color lid. And yeah, we are really highly encouraged to, in every way possible, to have most of our organics waste end up in that compost bin. And they've made that pretty standard for all of the city, which is
Wow. And it's not
amazing.
just because I think our yard waste bins say no composting. It's yard waste only. That's a downfall in Cedar Falls area,
Yep,
unfortunately, is
that's where
we
we
take
were.
yard waste only.
Yep, that was where we were a couple of years ago, and then they put in this giant um, compost processing center, and so they're able to do, because the reason why you don't collect both at the same time is if you don't have a hot enough digester and
Hmm.
like enough microbes and stuff in your composting center to really break those down in a timely manner and not like over the span of decades, which is what it would take for some, for some of those, little bugs to eat a piece of bread versus tree bark. Those are
Right.
two very different things that they have to do. But the one they've got here, they created one in Iowa City a couple of years ago, and they did a lot of testing and a lot of making sure that everything can be put into it and come out on the other end in a really short time span. And they've got it down now. And so the whole city is able to contribute any organics, yard waste, household organics. It's incredible.
That's amazing. I
Mhm.
would love to see something like that here. I have so many, well, my parents are starting a compost barrel
Yeah,
because I mean, my mom gardens, so she's going to use that in her gardening.
wonderful.
But I have so many friends that do that on their own. But
Mhm.
if they don't have a garden or somewhere else to put it or dispose of it, or say they live in an apartment or something like that, and they do not have a yard or garden that it can go in, eventually I don't compost. And that's something that I have wanted to do. I told myself it was in my New Year's resolution mini-sode. I'm going to start composting this year. And I haven't yet. And
Have
it
you
hasn't been
heard?
far,
Have
but
you heard of a worm bin?
yes, that is what, let's see, I believe my friend Clarissa and
And me.
and you
I've
and
got one.
my parents and a friend, Jaime and Stephanie, I believe they're looking into doing that too.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a
So,
really low cost, really easy way where it's really low maintenance. It's a lot more simple. But again, it comes down to like what do you do once you have like something that you can do? I mean, just go put it out anywhere. If you're walking to work one day and there's like a tree, you're like, oh, here you go. Here's some compost tree. Yeah. I think, that's the hardest part is we deal with this on campus at the university as well as just making it as easy as possible when students are walking to and from, going from place to place, to make sure that they can make the right decision when they need to. I think that's logistically difficult as it is in our own homes to make sure that, if we want to divert any sort of waste stream, it's not always easy to do. And we get a lot of questions from students now about why aren't there more composting bins like there's trash cans, there's recycle bins, but there are no compost bins. And so we're trying to pilot projects where we put those compost bins in highly trafficked areas to see, if we can actually make it a successful program. The difficulty is that, there's just a lot of contamination that ends up happening. Like people think you can throw chewing gum in, or it's not even things like that. It can be like clamshells from restaurants. If they feel like they're paper, they could come across as something that is compostable. When you're walking across campus, it feels like paper, so I'm going to put it in the compost bin, but it has a wax lining and therefore isn't compostable. But that's not something you just know off the top of your head, right? It feels like paper, I'm going to put it in the compost. That's a very logical and good decision to make. It's just the harder piece of like, we don't always know what's in the stuff that we are using, so we don't always make the decision we should because we don't have that knowledge and information. So it's another part of my job that I find absolutely fascinating. But yeah, making those decisions easier for people as they're going about their daily lives is sort of the trick, and also it keeps me in my job, which is fantastic.
It's always a good thing. Yes. With what you said about we don't always know what's in the materials that we're using, like the wish recycling, where you think, oh, well, I hope this is actually correct. I hope I cleaned this enough. And the how to recycle and how to compost labels have been extremely helpful to me recently, now that that's on like the majority of at least grocery store goods, because if the little plastic tray is actually recyclable or not. The film is not going to be, but at least you can recycle the tray. Like, it's hard. And why is it so hard to be sustainable and to have good habits and practices? Like, why?
Exactly. There are a dozen answers, and I think the number one is just we don't know. We're not able to know based on just the supply chain and the supply chains of everything that we come in contact with. It's just almost impossible for us to know everything that we are consuming and we're using and all of that stuff. And I think probably Olivia talked about a lot in her goal to be zero waste. It's got to be very difficult when I think the biggest obstacle to that is the education part, where how can I learn X, Y, and Z so that I know that I won't have these waste streams in the end. It's got to be right. And it's one thing to want to do that on a coast where there are a lot more options, and I'm sure more access to bulk stores, so you don't have to, purchase packaging and things. It's a unique issue in the Midwest, where especially like in rural Iowa, if I go back to my hometown, that's a wish.
I just saw her Instagram post. She went to the farmer's market out there and just filled her beautiful big mason jar with a bunch of blueberries. And I'm jealous.
It's idyllic, right? It sounds like something Cinderella would do, or like Snow White. That's truly amazing. And I'm glad to see it. It's not just, 10 years ago, that was what I was seeing come out of France and Italy, the European countries that really do embody the local is better approach to pretty much every single thing possible. And so that was coming out of there 10 years ago, and now it's coming out of California, which is wonderful. So I'm hoping
maybe it will make its way into the Midwest.
Exactly.
Well, it's I love my Midwest. I do.
It's made it to Chicago. It's happening a lot more in Chicago. So hey,
there.
Sometimes
it just Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sorry, we started to talk about the marine conservation earlier, and then we totally tangented. It's okay. We just get excited about things sometimes.
Yes.
But
If you start talking about garbage, look, I can't help myself.
Blake loves garbage. What did I read on here? I think it was from your website. Where is it? Blake loves trash, studying it, not creating it. Now, the motivation for it. So, tying back to the marine conservation, when we had chatted just previously about what we were going to wrap the episode around, it wasn't actually recycling and composting, but it was just sustainability in general. And also the motivation that we have to have here in the Midwest, being Mississippi River adjacent, because what we do here very much affects the Gulf of Mexico. And we touched on this with Des Moines Waterworks, Iowa Environmental Council's Jennifer Terry in that episode too.
Wonderful.
She's
Love
the
her.
boss.
She
She's
really
awesome.
is.
But yours was, we talked previously about the trash dilemma in the Gulf of Mexico too. Hers was more runoff and pesticides, which I mean, you obviously deal with as well, whole scope of sustainability. But was your motivation with marine conservation based on what you were seeing in rivers, or did that come from somewhere else?
That came from my master's thesis. I was, as part of my program here at the university, I was supposed to do an international research project somewhere overseas. And so I've been studying Spanish since I was a very young child. So I've always wanted to go to Mexico and sort of learn about some of the things there. And so in preparation for a master's thesis on some environmental policy, conservation issues in Mexico, I just sort of started doing a lot of research on the Mississippi and, what goes into the Gulf and how it gets into Mexico. And I was doing this research. I did some pretty interesting research with some other faculty members here at the university who study like Gulf streams and just ocean tides and stuff. And so we got really into just why the Gulf of Mexico is such an interesting landscape to study, in that it's essentially a bathtub. There's very few ins and outs for the water in the Gulf. There's like one jet stream that goes in and it takes everything out. And so everything in the Gulf of Mexico is sort of an interesting bathtub model to study. And so that's why every time that there's an oil spill in the Gulf, it's a very big deal. And then when I started just studying it, I was just studying, there was a lot of nutrient pollution, runoff sort of topics and stuff. But then I got very interested. There were a couple of grad students who have now gone to California to do their own work on other topics, but they were studying some of the garbage inputs from flooding events here in the Midwest. And so we have I very vividly remember the flood of 1993. My family was very affected. So we lived on the river at that time. And so, growing up with that flood and then the flood of 2008 happening. And then, there's floods every year now, it seems, which is not something that's going to stop anytime soon. But with those events happening, it was fascinating to learn of just how much of our stuff here in the Midwest ends up in the Mississippi from those events that we literally don't have control over, and that we don't have control over our stuff ending up in those places. And I always just have these pictures of like people's dining hutches just like floating down the river in Mississippi, And there's a lot of, exactly. There's just so many people that work on the Mississippi as well, cleaning it up of all of the stuff that gets put into it, whether on purpose or not. So I got really into doing those sorts of research questions, asking those questions, because we see it every time there's a flood, and that floods are happening so much more frequently. But then I ended up going to Mexico to do my research on the coast of Veracruz, which is it's a big town on the Gulf of Mexico, sort of right in the middle of the big curve. And so I designed a research study where I went and quantified and classified just how much garbage was on the beaches. And so I assumed it would be, garbage that was floating in with the tide, being deposited overnight and flowing out with the tide in the morning. And it turned out it was actually most of the garbage I was finding was just people who were visiting the beaches for recreation, were just leaving stuff behind that was then being taken out and thrown back in. And it was just really interesting. But there were also things that got floated back in as well. I found a bunch of medicine bottles that were in Russian that one morning when I was walking, so those had been brought up in the tide for some reason and left. And yeah, I found literally a ton of garbage that summer because I was there for the whole summer and I did a bunch of different beach cleans and I weighed all the garbage that I collected, and I ended up finding over a ton, literally a ton of garbage. And that I made friends with different waste collectors and stuff there because they have people who collect plastic and metal and things to be sold back into the recycling markets. So I would collect all this garbage and I would give it to these reclaimers who would then go and make money and stuff. And so again, it was very similar to my youth in that I spent that entire summer physically handling garbage. And so it was really eye-opening to see just the scope and the scale of the problem that we have as consumers in the society. It's not just the United States, it's happening everywhere in the world. Are sort of dealing with these problems of like, it's too easy to have single use everything. And it's so cheap to have single use everything that it's just becoming this massive problem. And so, yeah, that's sort of how I got into the marine environments and garbage and stuff. And then you can truly follow, you can just ping pong your way up in the Mississippi from the Gulf and just see compounding issues that, garbage, nutrient runoff, pollution, all that is having on communities. It's fascinating.
I find it so interesting and kind of, I don't know if it's a coincidence or causality. I don't know which conjugation for that one, but that Jennifer actually grew up on a dairy farm too, that both of you have sort of a more rural farm background in your childhood. And then this is what both of you have decided to focus your careers around. And I can't help but think, that both of you had that connection to being outdoors and maybe just paying attention more to like the garbage that you saw around or what, or just understanding that the Midwest, with us having mostly agriculture as kind of the main, we have like John Deere in the universities and things like that too, and meat packing, but that's kind of what the Midwest has. And, your family and her family too, just you are very connected to what goes on. And I think some of us, myself included, just aren't, because I've never had to look at my own trash. I think I'd be a little upset if I did. I think I'd be proud compared to like 5 to 10 years ago and just, what I'm not doing at least. But, that would be a very big reckoning if we all just looked at our garbage can. I'm very pleased to say, Matt and myself, we do not have children. If we miss a garbage day or two, if we forget to put the garbage can out, we're okay still. We're not a full garbage can kind of couple, but there's still more that we could do. But we mentioned that just before we started recording, actually, us as consumers have certain responsibilities, but also the systems that are in place also have a responsibility to help the consumers do what's right.
And arguably a larger one, I would say, for sure. I think, we've been sold a narrative that individuals can make a change, and I don't think that's wrong. I think if enough people refuse to take a plastic straw from McDonald's and they're wasting money by, supplying their stores with plastic straws, they'll stop doing, I think individuals together in groups can make changes at a larger level as well. But I also think those decision makers who have made it so incredibly easy and cheap to continue to use single-use items and dispose of them, and then little do we know that they're being disposed of improperly and unethically and in a very unjust way on populations all across the world. I think if if larger corporations and the larger hands that be at a much larger scale, I think they have a lot larger responsibility to kind of change the way that things are, more so than individual people do.
Definitely.
But I think it's going to take individual people to make that happen.
For sure. Well, and just letting them know, and like, well, now I'm very curious what type of impact I could possibly have on my community. I'm not signing myself up for this, but now I feel like I have to, trying to get a compost facility going, because that's a difficult part for municipalities that are not Iowa City, that do not have compost
Yes.
collection.
And I think, one thing that I think is even more important to stress, as I think we've learned over the past year in this pandemic times, is trying to find some ways for community to exist. And so I've listened to some interesting communal podcast ideas where people have said, if you live in a neighborhood, if you're in an urban setting or a suburban setting, and you have like-minded individuals around you, and someone has a backyard, or if there's a place where you can start like a community compost like bin or section of someone's yard to use as a compost bin that your community can use. Like finding those ways to find community on top of being sustainable as well. I don't think we would have as successful a sustainability movement over the past 20 years without the idea of just trying to build community as well.
For sure. And then you have more voices to speak up and clearly more interest, and you don't feel alone, because I feel like that sometimes that's it. You feel kind of alone in your endeavors if you don't necessarily have a group of people like that.
Especially here in the Midwest.
Oh my gosh. Indeed.
It can be, being someone who's a little bit more green-minded, it can be a little bit more difficult in certain areas. So yeah.
Definitely. And those are the voices that aren't always, maybe I don't know if it's a fear to speak up or just feeling like you're alone and there's no point. But I mean, even one voice that gets to be heard maybe inspires someone else. But if you get a whole group together and go to your next city council meeting, maybe when they see that there are more people that are actually interested and you're not just that crunchy weirdo, then something will actually happen.
And definitely making that tie back to, that's one thing we do at the university, is just helping students realize that their voice matters and that they should have ownership over what's happening in their residence hall, in their city block, on campus, in the city. They should have ownership over the things that they want to see happen in those places. And we say quite often, you're paying to be here. This is your tuition. This is your money that are paying us to do the jobs that we do. So tell us what you want us to do. Tell us how you want the university or Iowa City or the state of Iowa. How do you want it to look? What do you want it to be like when you come back as an alumni in 25 years? What would make you so happy to see? And those are the things that we want to put into place. But it goes to the same to people who live in, apartment buildings or neighborhoods around in urban areas or even rural areas, like taking ownership over the fact that you pay taxes to certain places. So you should have a say in what is happening with your waste or your garbage, and learning those sorts of steps that, you can have ownership and you can have a voice, and it matters.
I love that. And if you're not producing as much trash, but you're producing compost, then it reminds me when I was bartending. This is a very weird analogy. When I was bartending, for sure, so many people in the service industry smoke because they get to have a break.
Yep.
I was the only one who didn't smoke. And I said, dang it, man, I want a 15-minute break. I'm not a smoker, so I'm not allowed. Can I get a fresh air break? I don't feel like this is fair. So yeah, of course, sure. If you're not granted, it does cost a little more money for a compost, a little bit more money for a compost facility to get put in as compared to my bartending manager to pay me to walk outside for 15 minutes and breathe fresh air. But, if you're not using all of the services, why not?
Yeah.
You're paying for that tax. And everyone has their garbage payment, whether you have your small garbage bin or your large garbage bin. But if you're not even using that, it would be ideal if you're disposing of something in an alternative way to have that taken care of. That's also less stress on the garbage on the landfill and garbage removal in the area too, if you're making less stuff.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we could do a whole podcast episode on just the garbage system. It is a behemoth of a system, but I talk about garbage a lot because I teach a whole class on garbage every fall at the university. So yeah, I definitely have very, very much an interest in this, but yeah, we could talk about landfills and all over the world and in the United States. And it's fascinating, but it comes back to the point of like, I would be interested to hear what Olivia has to say does she have a garbage service anymore that comes and takes her trash away? Like, is she still paying the same city rate as her neighbors who are producing enough trash that they can't even close their lid every week, right? They're both essentially paying the same exact fee to use a lot different amount of space in that landfill, right? So noticing those sorts of things and understanding that you as a person do have an equal say over what happens in your community, be that your apartment building, your neighborhood, your city, and learning the tools for how to advocate for what you really want to see, I think are some of the most important things we can teach people of any age.
I wrote that question down because I would like to remember to ask her that either
Very interested
on a podcast or I might message her on Instagram as soon as we end our recording here because I'm very intrigued. I would assume since there's not to speculate on her garbage, but kind of, she does post those pictures every month, but the amount of garbage that she is now producing is funny. You could probably fit it in my gigantic coffee cup. Like really, yeah.
And like I have a much different. It's very interesting now. I have a now 1-year-old son, and so the past year has been an interesting struggle of like, wow, I just produce so much more garbage than I ever thought I ever would in my entire life, just because I now have a tiny human who has diapers and goes to daycare and has to have disposable ones. And yeah, it's a struggle, but I'd be very interested to hear.
Yeah, definitely. We're gonna have to follow up. I'm getting, who knows, maybe we'll have Olivia on separately. Maybe we'll have you on again. I would love to have both of you on separately again, but it could be fun to do a combo episode. We've never done that.
That would be fun.
That would be intriguing. That would be interesting. I'll put that in my notes for next season. So you had mentioned you would listen to some communal podcast type of podcasts. That was not said eloquently. It's okay. But do you have any other podcast recommendations? You can advertise someone else's podcast on this podcast. That's totally fine. Or any book recommendations, any books that were just like, oh my gosh, this is eye-opening. Any recommendations for consumers and trash makers and people that would like to make less trash?
Yes. Although Corey, you might have to edit some of this.
We got to pull up the Kindle app or whatever one you happen to be using.
I know. So I think like all of the NPRs, they always do a lot of really interesting segments that are bite-sized pieces, especially in April. If you go back and you look at pretty much anything they produce that has a Earth Month sort of lens. And so they have a lot of that. So really anything NPR. And then I think it's How to Save a Planet with Dr.
Familiar.
Yes, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who is going to be one day she's going to be the next director of NOAA. I just interviewed her a couple weeks ago. She's an incredible human being.
Oh my goodness.
She does a really great podcast. I think it's called How to Save a Planet.
I'm pretty sure it is, and I'm pretty sure I at least follow her on Instagram.
Yeah, she is creating science communication that is understandable and thoughtful and just and ethical. It's incredible. I definitely recommend that one. I mean, there's a lot of, if you're really interested in garbage, there's one specific garbage podcast. I can't remember the name of it. It has a purple logo. It's good. I'm going to think of it in like 2 hours. And it's going to drive me nuts.
Of course you are. We can put that in the notes for sure.
And then I think if anybody's really interested, this being a food and beverage podcast, I'm I would love to have and hear more just about seafood in the Midwest. How is that a thing? I don't quite understand, even though many people have tried to explain it to me. Yeah, it's so interesting living in Iowa because we just don't have the relationship with the outdoors that a lot of other people do. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of people fishing and eating the fish that they catch, it makes me cringe because I grew up, in the middle of nowhere. People would go fishing on the river by my house all the time, but you don't eat the fish. You don't eat the fish. That's just how it is.
Have you watched? I have not yet. Have you watched Seaspiracy?
No, I have a couple of friends who work for Greenpeace, and they're pretty anti it, understandably. And I've heard a lot of cons, like a lot of people against it.
Oh, to the documentary.
Yeah, but I think it's mostly just because I think they take one very specific approach and very specific opinion to mass global fishing. I don't think it's a wrong one to take. I think it's very interesting to highlight, especially if they get people talking about the fishing practices that are happening globally that are just deteriorating, demolishing our fishing stocks for many generations to come, which is incredibly depressing. But I think this is the food and beverage podcast. So like one book that was really eye-opening to me was For Fish by Paul Greenberg. Definitely Paul Greenberg. I think. He writes for the New York Times. But he wrote a book called For Fish, and it follows the history of 4 really important fish that we eat, like cod, tuna, trout. It follows the history of these 4 specific fish and how they made it onto our plates and just how they became such an unsustainable food source when they used to not be. So yeah, that one really opened my eyes to just the larger global fishing industry. Sure. And also brings it back home because trout, people are fishing for trout here.
Oh my goodness, we went camping a few weekends ago, and there is a fish hatchery where we went camping outside of Manchester, Iowa. And I was not even aware of the trout streams, the magical trout streams that apparently exist in Iowa. I thought we had like corn, pigs, and soybeans, but like trout. Were you
in is that in the Northeast?
Yes. Yep.
That's trout streams.
Yeah.
The only place we have them, they're beautiful.
Oh my goodness. The streams there were absolutely beautiful. Loved camping there. If you're looking for it's not off-grid camping, but most people haven't heard of it, and it's just like 40 minutes away. It's Bailey's Ford outside of Manchester, Iowa.
Awesome. Yeah, I've heard it up by Manchester and by like Palo.
Mm-hmm.
I've only ever seen it. I've never heard it. I've never, one of those towns where is it? Yeah. Anyway, is it Nevada or Nevada? Who knows?
Oh gosh.
I know.
And there's the town and there's the state, and I think they're actually pronounced differently.
I don't get it. But yeah, so there's a lot of fisheries in there's not a lot. There's a couple trout streams in Northeast Iowa that we are known for as having amazing trout streams, and the DNR is actually approving a CAFO, like a hog confinement, really close to one of the most popular trout streams, and they approved the permits for it, and now there's a huge public uprising because it's not going to go well for those trout streams. Yeah, it's really contentious up there right now. But
this is in the Manchester, like Dubuque area.
Yeah, it's up there because the trout stream region is very small. Like it's not a lot of Iowa. It's a very specific part of Iowa, and the DNR approved this CAFO very close to and it's like there's just so much more space in Iowa that you can go. You don't have to go to our trout streams. Let them be. It's very contentious. Yeah, I would.
That's very close to me.
Yeah, and there's always I have a couple contacts at the DNR who do fisheries, who run stock fisheries every year. They do that sort of work, and they have like a much different lens. They see fish and fishing through, and they just have a much more interesting story that I think might be good for people here in the Midwest who like eat fish and go catch fish and stuff. It's very fascinating.
Sure. That makes me a little bit, I mean, not that I have to have my own desires satisfied by information and facts and things like that, but
It's nice when
I
they
will
are.
say it really is. I had just started eating fish again, and then Seaspiracy came out, and I thought, I
Yep.
have to reevaluate my thoughts on fish again.
Yep.
But we're
Yeah.
constantly doing that. You get more information, and then you have to you don't have to, but it'd be nice if you like thought about things once you've had more information.
Yeah.
But it changes.
Yeah. And I mean, it goes back to the number one thing the number one piece of advice I give to even all of the students that I come across on campus when I get asked for advice. It's just, when in doubt, just go local.
Mhm.
I mean, as local as you can be. Know your neighbor, know your farmer, know where you get your dairy. It
Yes.
doesn't, I'm not going to say don't eat beef. If I like the beef I eat comes from my parents' farm, it couldn't be more sustainable and it couldn't be less, it can have a lower impact on our
Mhm.
global economy and our global market, and my carbon footprint couldn't be lower from eating that. But if someone else doesn't have that ability or connection to find someone who's local, who does that sort of thing, it's like, yeah, maybe question your beef and that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's just, my piece of advice isn't like, don't eat beef, don't eat chicken, try to eat Impossible Burgers. It's more like, try to keep it as local as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you. And for that reminder, that's always just nice too, because I am definitely a person that gets caught up in doing everything the best way that I can, but then also having to look at, okay, getting sustainably, kindly raised buffalo burgers from 20 minutes away is technically going to be more sustainable than eating an Impossible Burger with a whole bunch of ingredients wrapped in plastic and paper at my grocery store that is local. But where did it come from, and how many, all of the ingredients that got shipped and then shipped to my store or the holding facility in between? Like,
yeah.
Yeah,
I try and think of, I mean, it's not a great thing to think about all the time, but it's very interesting to think like how many hands have touched like the thing that you're buying, like not in a gross way, but like, how many people interacted with the product or whatever it is before you purchased it, because it's usually a lot higher than you think, especially with like clothes and food. It's always a lot higher than you'd think. So if I'm purchasing something, and I'm very lucky to be able to have this, I'm now in my 30s. So, I mean, if you asked me at 18, this would not be my answer as a very broke person, but like now I just try to find stuff that is as local as I can get it. And then as few people have touched it as possible, because that usually means that the carbon footprint of it's a lot lower.
Definitely. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you for having me. This was such a joy.
It was. We started in one direction and then we went in a different direction. And there's always undiscovered directions that I think are like the exciting parts, where like we get a little excited and we're like, oh, we're going to get feisty on this one. This could be a whole nother episode. Well, tell our listeners where they can find what you're doing. I know the broad question. I mean, U of I has their department.
Yep. So all of the work things are at Sustain UI. So SUSTAIN UI, all one word. And then me on everything is Blake at Iowa. So it's BLAKE at ATIOWA.
Gotta define the at for the
I was like,
handles.
that's right.
No, that yes, it's like the hashtag crowd. And the pound sign.
Yes.
Too good. Wonderful. Well, thank you, listeners, for checking in with another episode of the Ethical Consumer Podcast. This has been Blake Rupe, and I am your host, Julia, discussing about what she works with University of Iowa Sustainability, and the whole other can of worms, or the barrel of worms, the worm barrel that we opened up partway through. So this has been fun, guys. I will see you next time.